Hello everyone, welcome to another video from Fantasy Football Scout. My name is Az, and today I'm doing something that I've wanted to do for quite a while, which is do a bit of a video for new members who are maybe picking up FPL for the first time, haven't played before, maybe seen their friends or work colleagues play it and want to know what all the fuss is about and that kind of thing. So if you're an existing player of the game, if you've played for years and you're looking for some really kind of experience and in-depth advice, this probably isn't the video for you. If you're new to the game, then stick around and hopefully I can explain some of the basics and some of the pitfalls that you might fall into. So if you don't know, Fantasy Football Scout are a website dedicated to fantasy football advice and tools and tips. There's some information on the screen for you now. So if you like this video and you want to go that one step further into the wonderful world of fantasy football, then sign up to Fantasy Football Scout and you'll see there's loads of tools and loads of great articles and videos that you can watch over there. So just to start with, just why play FPL? I mean, I'm sure you've got your reasons if you're watching this video. You might be in it for the competition. Maybe you've got a work league and you want to join in and you want to win and you want to show everyone your football knowledge, and maybe there's the money that's involved, or if it's just pride, all those kind of things. You might be starting fantasy football a bit like me. So I started because I knew there's a big, obviously, social side to watching football and being involved in football. So when I started at university, I wanted to be the person who knew a lot about football so I could talk to people easier and all that kind of stuff. And it's really interesting just how many conversations watching and knowing about football can open up as you kind of talk to random people, the postman, the waiter at the bar, at the pub, all these people have something to say about football. So the more you know, the easier it often is to start a conversation. So you might be doing it for that, or you might be doing it just because your friends are playing it and you want to kind of enjoy football a bit more. And I think that's one of the things that I've got a lot out of fantasy football is games that I previously wouldn't have watched. So Burnley v Stoke, for example, when you've got players playing in those games, suddenly those games mean a bit more, and it means that you get your friends around, you watch it, and you can cheer on games which you would otherwise probably not have even bothered watching. So whatever the reasons for playing it, it's an amazing game. There's an amazing community out there. So I strongly recommend you go onto Twitter, you start following some accounts who tweet a lot about FPL, and you just get involved in the community, and you never know kind of what it can build from there. I mean, I started off just on Fantasy Football Scout forum, just talking to a few people on there, became a moderator on the boards, and now I do content and videos and stuff, and it's my full-time job. So, it's a crazy story for me, and obviously you probably won't all go that way, but with 8 million players and growing, there really is a huge amount of people who play and to talk to and interact with, and it's a great community. So I strongly recommend you get involved in that. So I guess the most sensible place to start with is the rules of the game. The better you kind of understand these rules, the more you'll kind of know how the game works and how you get points and how you kind of beat everyone. You've got to start somewhere, right? This is for the FPL games, so the Fantasy Premier League official game. Obviously, there's lots of other games now for fantasy football that you can do. There's the Sky game, which is slightly different to these rules. There's Fan Team as well, which is similar, but obviously you have to pay money to play that. There's games like Fan Tracks and other draft leagues. There's kind of a whole array of different games out there. Normally, we tend to focus on this channel on FPL. We do some videos for other games out there, but normally when you hear people talking about fantasy football, they will be talking about the official Premier League game, and it's pretty much the easiest one to start with and to pick up. So if you are playing for the first time, this is probably quite a good introduction at least before you start experimenting with some of the other games. So in terms of the rules, so when you've signed up, you will obviously be able to pick your team, and your team consists of 15 players. So 2 goalkeepers, 5 defenders, 5 midfielders and 3 forwards. You get a budget of £100 million, and each player is essentially assigned a different value based on effectively how good they are, or how good the people who do the prices perceive they are. So someone like Harry Kane, for example, who scores lots of goals for Spurs, is going to be priced really high, and someone who plays for Watford, who's just been promoted, is probably going to come in at quite a lot less. You can select up to 3 players from a single Premier League team, and obviously the idea of it is that you have a starting 11 each week of these players, and you're rewarded for their performances on the pitch. So it's not necessarily to do with how well they play in the game. There are certain criteria which they have to meet in order to get points. So we'll go through those in a bit more detail in a second. So when you select your starting 11, so these are the players who you think out of your 15 in a given week, they're going to be the ones that get you the most points. You then put 4 players on your bench. So you'll have a goalkeeper always on your bench, and then you'll have different combinations. You might want to bench a forward because they've got a tough game against a good defence. You might bench a defender because they're playing Liverpool or Man City, for example. So you can play your team in any formation, but you always need to have one goalkeeper, 3 defenders, and at least 1 forward. And you need to make sure that you've got at least 2 midfielders as well. The rest of it you can choose and bench with kind of whoever you want. So out of that squad, you then choose a captain, and your captain earns double points. And you select a vice captain. That vice captain doesn't get any benefit unless your captain doesn't play. And then that captaincy, the captain's armband, as we like to call it, gets moved over to the vice captain. Now, your bench order is really important because your bench order decides who comes on for any players that miss out. So if you only have one player that doesn't play, maybe he gets an injury in training, or it doesn't make the match squad for whatever reason, your first bench player that isn't your goalkeeper will come on for that player. Obviously, if your goalkeeper misses out, then your reserve goalkeeper will come on. If your first sub doesn't play as well, then your second sub will come on. And if he doesn't play, then the third sub will come on. But typically, it will be the first sub that comes onto the pitch. Obviously, if you have 3 players that miss out in your first 11, then you'll get 3 players off your bench. If you have any more players that miss out, so if you have 4 or 5 that miss out, then you can only get a maximum of the 3 kind of off your bench. So that's important to bear in mind. So benches, in terms of importance, it's good to have a strong bench. But as we'll talk about in a bit, I think what I see from quite a few new players is they put too much money on the bench. And actually, the amount of times in which you get players off your bench doesn't warrant having so much money tied up there. So it tends to be a much better strategy to prioritise putting money into your first 11 than it is to kind of spread the money around your squad. But we'll talk about that a bit more in a bit. So transfers. So how transfers work are every week you can transfer out 1 player for free, and there's no points or anything involved in that. Obviously, you can only trade them out for equivalent value that player's worth. So, for example, if you transfer out Harry Kane, you will have 13 or 12.5 million to spend on whichever striker you want. So you can effectively get anyone in the game, which is great. But if you transfer out someone like Danny Welbeck, who's only worth 6 million, you have to go to a forward who's worth the same amount of money. You can tie this in with other transfers as well. So you can make 2 transfers. So you could take out Welbeck and a midfielder, and then you might have different amounts of budget to kind of play with. But for every transfer you make over the one free, you have to pay 4 points to make that. So the general consensus is to try and limit these hits, as they're called, as much as possible. It's not always easy, especially when you've got lots of injuries and you want to make sort of big changes to your squad. But a lot of the time, sort of being patient with players and waiting can help. The other good thing about being patient is that if you don't make a transfer one week, you get 1 rolled over to the next week. So whereas you have 1 free transfer in game week 1, if you don't make a transfer, you'll then have 2 free transfers in game week 2, and then it's a lot easier to modify your squad. That doesn't continue, so you don't get 3 in game week 3 if you don't make a transfer. It's up to a maximum of 2. So you want to make sure that you're kind of using at least 1 transfer every 2 weeks. In terms of chips, so chips were introduced about 6-7 years ago, and they've kind of changed a lot of people's strategies. So what's really important to bear in mind here, and I see it all the time, people using chips in game week 1, you only get 1 of these chips a year. So you get 1 of each chip throughout the season. So you think you've got 38 game weeks to go. You don't want to use all your chips in game week 1, or we can't anyway. You can use one a week, but you don't want to use all your chips too quickly. So the chips you get a bench boost. So the points scored by your bench players in the next game are including your total. So that's where actually having more expensive bench players might pay off. Free hit means that you can make unlimited free transfers for a single game week. And then at the next deadline, your squad is returned to how it was at the start of the game week. So essentially, if you can't use it in game week 1 because there's no squad to revert to. But if you set up your squad for game week 1, and then in game week 2, you decide you're going to play the free hit chip, you can then completely take out as many players as you want, completely redo your whole team, and then in game week 3 it'll go back to that game week 1 squad. It's a really good chip to use, and I think it has the biggest potential of all the chips that are out there, but it can equally backfire. So if you've got a good squad and you decide to take them all out and try a whole new squad, a lot of the times your first squad might actually outscore the squad that you free hitted to. So there's different strategies about when it's best to use that, and we'll cover that in a different video. Triple captain, so a really simple one. Your captain points are tripled instead of doubled. It's not as amazing as it sounds, especially when you think of if you captain a player, you're going to get 2 times their points anyway. You're actually only adding on an extra kind of 100% to that total. So, for example, a really good score for a player would be 15. If you had them captained, you'd get 30. If you had them triple captained, you'd get 45. You're only actually getting 15 points more than if you captain. So that chip has only been worth 15 points to your team. So don't get too worried about that. I mean, at the end of the season, you're going to have thousands of points, and that 15 points isn't going to be the biggest thing in the world. So don't worry too much about that chip. It's a fun one. I tried to have a bit of fun with it. And the last one here, and probably the most important one, are your wildcards. So rather than the other chips, you get two wildcards a season. You get one that you can use right up to the new year, and then one that you can use after that. So you have to use that wildcard before the new year rocks up. And what that lets you do is it lets you make as many changes to your squad, and then that is permanent from then on. So rather than the free hit where it reverts, the wildcard lets you make as many changes as you like. Now the advantage of that is if you do have a squad with players who aren't playing, maybe you've lost their place, maybe injured, something like that, or you want to get in players like Kane and Fernandes, and it's going to cost you too many points to make transfers to take them in and out, you can use that wildcard and you can set your team up really nicely. As it's such an important chip, making sure you use it at the right time is one of the most fundamentally important things, I think, in FPL. So you don't want to use it just for the sake of it. You don't want to use it maybe just because you're missing 1 or 2 players. You want to use it when your squad really needs it, or when you really want to target some good fixtures or players that are in form that you otherwise can't get to. So just bear that in mind, and don't make sure you don't use that one unless you kind of have to. So deadlines, yeah, so we're going to talk a bit about some of the mistakes people make, but deadlines are really important. This list, I mean, you don't need to staple this list to your wall. Most deadlines are either a Friday or a Saturday. So when there's an evening game on a Friday, the deadline will be an hour and a half before that game kicks off. On a Saturday, often most of the time they start at 12:30, so the deadline will be at 11 o'clock. We do see some fluctuations in that throughout the season. So sometimes there's midweek games. Sometimes there's games a bit later, so you do need to kind of be a little bit aware of when games are being played, but it will tell you on the FPL website when we get there, exactly when those games are. Now scoring, so this is really important, and this is where I think a lot of people they want to play FPL, they want to play fantasy football, and they build a squad, and the squad looks great for a real football team. Declan Rice is in there, Kante's in there, holding midfielder. Oh, it's brilliant. But you don't get points for being a good player. You get points for quite specific things. So here's the things you get points for. So you get a point for playing up to 60 minutes. You get 2 points for playing over 60 minutes. 6 points for a goal scored by a defender or a goalkeeper. 5 points for a midfielder and 4 points for a forward. So forwards who score the most goals typically will get less points than a midfielder. An assist is 3, so it doesn't matter who gets it, defender, midfielder or striker. You always get 3 points for that. Now, clean sheets for goalkeepers or defenders, you get 4 points for a clean sheet. Once the other team scores, that clean sheet goes if that player's on the pitch. So if you've got Van Dijk and he gets to 60 minutes, he'll get his 2 points for playing 60 minutes. He'll then get his 4 points for a clean sheet. If he's on the pitch and then the other team score, he'll lose that clean sheet. So that is one of the biggest frustrations in FPL, when you've got defenders on and you think you're on for lots of points and they lose that clean sheet. Midfielders get 1 extra point for a clean sheet, which doesn't sound like much, but can actually be quite a handy one to get if you've got a midfielder who it's just a bit of an extra bonus for them. Goalkeepers get 1 point for every 3 shots saved, which I've always found to be quite stingy. So a goalkeeper that makes 9 saves, for example, will only get 3 points. So if you think a goalkeeper making 9 saves in the game, that is like literally incredible, but it won't actually help them too much. Obviously, it can build up. They get 3 points and then the clean sheet and then bonus points we talk about in a bit, but typically goalkeepers are the lowest scoring players in fantasy football, which is why you probably want to kind of prioritise other positions rather than them. Penalty saves, get them 5. So goalkeeper makes a penalty save, obviously. That does really well. It's a lot of points to get. Penalty misses are -2, so bear that in mind when you're picking penalty takers. Obviously they're good because they get goals, but if they miss, they do lose points. Now bonus points, I'm going to go into a bit more detail in another video, but essentially at the end of a match, they will look at stats and they'll work out which players performed the best according to a set of criteria. So it is quite complicated how this is kind of worked out. But typically, players who perform well in the game will earn extra points. So one player in a game will earn 3, one player will earn 2, and one player will earn 1. It used to be a guy, sort of a man in the stand, and he would just pick the players that he thought were playing the best. It's now based on Opta stats, so you can't really argue it. You can argue about which criteria they're using, but you can't really argue with the numbers. So you can see that on the FPL website who is earning the most bonus, and you can sort of build your strategy around that if you need to. Earning bonuses is just a really good way of players earning extra points, and there's some players who continuously hit these stats and do well and earn good bonus points. When a defender or goalkeeper concedes more than 2 goals, they lose a point. They lose a point. Anyone would lose a point for getting a yellow card. Anyone lose 3 points for getting a red card, and will lose 2 points for scoring an own goal. Just something to mention with red cards as well is if a defender gets red carded and then that team goes on to concede more and more goals, that defender will keep losing points as if he's still on the pitch. And the reason for that is because, say you had Bednarak and it was 1-0 and he got sent off and he got -2, then Liverpool played them and they beat them 9-0. The other defenders on the pitch would end up on less points than Bednarak because they'd keep losing points for this every 2 goals scored. So it's just a way of making sure that players are still kind of punished for being sent off and probably being a reason why that team's gone on to lose the game. This is some example about the BPS, the bonus points, and how they're calculated. I won't go into this; it's quite a lot of information. But these are the different criteria in which players can earn these bonus point scores, and the player with the highest bonus point score will get either the 3, the 2, or the 1. Leagues, you can join different leagues. So if you set up a work league or anything like that, Fantasy Football Scout have a league. So the link to that is in the description. You can do head-to-head as well, or public. There's a cup as well, which is about, I think it starts about mid-season. Very, very hard to win. You've got about 4 or 5 million people in that cup, and every week it's a knockout. So very difficult. Fantasy Football Scout as well do different cups as well. So be sure to check those out too. So when you first log into FPL, you're going to be presented with a screen like this or something similar to this. It can be a bit overwhelming at first trying to build a squad, so I'm just going to talk you through some of the kind of basics of how we do that. I spend way too much time on this screen. I will be during pre-season and I will be during the season as well because I'm addicted, and hopefully soon you will be too. So what you want to do here is you want to start building a team of players who you think are going to do well throughout the season, bearing in mind those rules. So players are priced, as I said, based on how well they've maybe performed in previous seasons or how good their teams are. So the likes of Robertson are obviously going to be more expensive than the likes of like Lamptey from Brighton. And what you want to try and do here is get a good balance of players from different sides. So you want some like top players, but you won't be able to have a team with your budget of only players from like Man City and Liverpool. So you want to make sure that you kind of spread that money out. So I'll build a very basic squad now, just to kind of show you, and then we can kind of go from there. So a lot of people, I think, focus very much on points from last season. So when you look at this list, the players are ranked in order of how well they did last year. So Martinez, out of all goalkeepers, scored the most points. Ederson's up there, Meslier, Lloris, Pope. So it can be very tempting just to see this list and be like, right, I'll have the top scoring goalkeeper, I'll have the top scoring defender. Doesn't often work like that. Sometimes you've got to bear in mind that players their prices have gone up a lot because of how well they performed last year. Doesn't always mean they're going to be worth it this year. So Martinez is a good example. I mean, Martinez is obviously a fantastic goalkeeper, just won the Copa America, goalkeeper of the season arguably, but are Villa a good enough team where he is going to justify being one of the most expensive players now in the game? So if you compare him to the likes of Sanchez at Brighton, for example, he's $1 million less. So this is where you might want to start thinking about how you can maybe save a bit of money. And goalkeepers tend to be the lowest scoring position. So Martinez had an absolutely unbelievable season last year. He got 186 points, which is more than the likes of Robertson. But then you look at midfielders and forwards, and you look at Fernandes, Salah, Son, Mane. Actually not Mane, but a lot of players come from the squad. If you look at the next, so if you look at Edison, so playing for the best team in the league, won the league comfortably, he got 160 points, which is less than even some defenders like Robertson and Alisson. It's less than the likes of Dallas, Rashford, Mane. It's there's a lot of players who outscored him. So you need to kind of bear that in mind. So I've got Sanchez in my team. I think he's a great option at 4.5. I tend to put quite a little money as I can into goalkeepers. So going for a double up like Sanchez and Steele is very sensible. The good thing about this as well is if Sanchez doesn't play, Steele is going to play, so he'll come in for him. The one thing you've got to bear in mind with that is that you can only have 3 slots. So if you wanted to have, for example, Lamptey, you're not going to be able to get Welbeck as well, because that would take you over the 3. So then you kind of want to just go through these teams and work out who you think are going to be the top scorers. It can be very tempting to do something like this and go for, I'll get Robertson, I'll get Diaz, I'll get someone like Luke Shaw in. And what you'll find is if you adopt this strategy, you'll very quickly see that you kind of run out of money. So what I like to do is build a kind of a balanced team. So you go for a premium defender. You maybe go for a mid-price defender around 5 million or 5.5. So I think we can include Shaw in that. And then you want to think about maybe a cheaper goalkeeper as well. So someone like, for example, Eiling, if you think Leeds are going to do well, something like that. And you've got to play 3 defenders every week. So these can be your kind of starting 3. And then you can think about your bench. So you might think to yourself, okay, well, I do want to get in, someone from West Ham. So maybe like Soufal. I can then put Eiling on the bench. Maybe I want to go for maybe Crystal Palace, for example. And I want to go for, they really don't really need defenders, Mitchell as well. That to me is about as much money as you want to put in a defence. If you're putting more than that in, then you're going to be quite defence heavy, and you're going to have to make sacrifices in midfield and up front. So that's about the kind of the maximum that I would be paying for my defence. So how much is that? That's about 12.5, 17, 21, about 26, 27 million, something like that. So around a quarter of your budget, which makes sense when you think about it, but in your kind of whole defence. So then you can start looking at midfielders, and this is where you probably want to start investing a bit more money. So the likes of Salah, for example, is going to be absolutely key, and Fernandes as well. You probably want to go for both of those two. A really good thing to check as you start building these isn't just to grab players who you think are good players. If you click on their information and you go to fixtures, you can actually see the fixtures that they've got. If you head over to Fantasy Football Scout as well, you'll see that there's something called the fixture ticker, which lets you really easily see which teams are playing who, when, and that can be really helpful when kind of building a squad. So that's maybe a bit more kind of on the advanced side. I think at this point it's probably good just to get a squad together, and then you can start making tweaks based on that. So you've got your 2 premiums. So again, adopting the same strategy as in defence, you then need to start thinking, okay, I can't just get Son and Mane and other really expensive players. I'm going to have to start thinking a bit cheaper. So if we move down to the mid-price area of around 7 and 8, you've got players like Grealish, who you obviously know. You've got players like Maddison. You've got players like Mason Mount as well, 7.5. So we can put him in. And then you've got to think, okay, so now I need to get someone even cheaper than that. So you could go for someone like Rafinha, who's a really good price at just 6.5 for Leeds. And now, remember, you're going to have to bench a midfielder. Unless you're going to play 5 in midfield and bench a striker, you're going to have to bench one of a striker or a midfielder along with your 2 defenders, if that's the formation you're going to play. So there's no point in getting another 6 million, 7 million midfielder who you're going to have to bench every week if you're not going to adopt that strategy. You might as well get someone cheap. And so what often a lot of people do is this is where it's a bit more acceptable just to grab a player who you're not expecting to get too many points. So a really popular one here is Basuma. So he's 4.5, which is the cheapest price for a starting midfielder in the game. You're not going to expect him to get 200 points in a season, but what you do get is just a cheap way of someone who can sit on your bench and come in and get you 2 points or 3 points as and when you kind of need it. So that gives you 22 million in the bank. So then you might be thinking, okay, I probably can't afford Harry Kane with that, because if I get in Kane, I'm only going to have 9.5 to get in 2 strikers, which isn't very much. So this is where kind of, learning about your budget can kind of really help. So you're probably going to have to go a bit cheaper. So you could grab in someone like Ollie Watkins. You could grab in players like Tony is really popular at 6.5. And then you've got 8 million left to buy another striker. So you could get in someone like Bamford. So I very much doubt that when you put a squad together, it will go as kind of simple as that. And I'm amazed actually it did for me, to be fair. But hopefully it just gives you an idea of of the different kind of structure in which you can do things. Obviously you can completely ignore this. You could go for Robertson, and you could grab Trent, and you could grab Chilwell, for example, and you could say, right, I'm going to go really hard on defence. I'm going to play 4 at the back every week. I'm going to bin off someone like Mount and just get in another cheap midfielder, and not even bother with him. Like Elneny, for example. I'm going to ditch Kufau, and I'm going to get in something like that. And you can say, okay, so now my formation has changed. So now I've got 2 cheap midfielders who I'm not expecting many points from, but I'm going to play an extra defender each week, and I'm going to play 4 at the back, and then I'm going to play Rafinha, Salah and Fernandes, and then 3 up front. So you can adopt formations based on who you think are going to score the most points. My best ever season I had when I finished around 800th in the world was I went against the grain, and I started with a really strong defence, and I favoured really attacking fullbacks. And because no one else was really doing it, it kind of put me ahead. So just doing the same thing as everyone else isn't often the way to win. If you think there's, midfielders are going to be really high scoring, you're seeing some midfielders there like Grealish and Son and Mane, and you're thinking, I'm just going to get all these guys and go really cheap everywhere else. It's completely viable. It's your team. Obviously, you can manage it how you want. But I would suggest when you're starting out for the first time, you try and adopt quite a balanced squad, as I did in the first part of this section. So just for the final part of this video, I just like to talk about some of the most common mistakes I see when people are making their teams and making their kind of initial squads, and then kind of some things as this kind of season progresses. So I think the biggest problem I see when, obviously I've had friends starting FPL for the first time, I think quarantine and lockdown has kind of made people kind of want to get involved. And when I see a lot of people's teams, I look at the squad and I think, yeah, you've got a pretty strong team, but you've got too much money all over in all 15 of your positions. And what that can mean is, if you're trying to get someone like Salah and Fernandes, you need the money from the cheaper players like Basuma, like I talked about, to free up that cash. And if you've got, 6 million defenders right across your back line and no one under sort of 5 or 6 million in your team, you're probably going to have less of these premium players who tend to get the most points in FPL. You also need to think it from a captaincy standpoint. The captain getting double points is one of the trickiest things in FPL, and it's mostly the premium players that you're going to be relying on to get those captaincy points. So having at least 2 premium players, I think, is hugely important. I see some teams where they've got an incredibly sort of balanced squad. All their players are 6 and 7 million, and it just means they're going to be captaining the likes of Ollie Watkins or Bamford every week, and they just tend to not be the most reliable players to back on. So I would really suggest that your bench are your cheapest players, and you make sure you don't overinvest and have too much money tied up on your bench. It just means that if you're trying to get in players, you're going to find it harder to make changes to your team if all your money's on your bench. On the flip side of that, I see a lot of people who maybe go for too many premiums. So they might try and get in Fernandes, Kane, Son, and Mane, and then the rest of their team, they're having to get in sort of 5 or 6 million, maybe sort of, forwards and midfielders. And it just means you've got such reliance on those premiums to deliver every week. The rest of your team really suffers. FPL, just like regular football, is very much a team game. You'll be surprised with big scores you can get from players who maybe are 6 or 7.5 million. So having a whole team of players that are really cheap just means that you're more limited in probably the points that you're going to get. So my suggestion would be pick 2 that you think are going to do really well, and then build your team around those. You could maybe stretch to 3 as well, but any more than 3 and you're going to find that your team is going to massively suffer and it won't be worth it. So if you're a new player, maximum of 3 premiums in your squad. The third one here is quite an elementary mistake, and I completely see why people do it. But it normally comes from a sort of not understanding the rules and how people earn points. So, for example, Kante is a really popular player that I see in FPL. He's often like 5 million. He's playing for a top side. People think, he's going to do really well in the game, one of the best players in the world and all this. But when it comes down to scoring goals, getting assists, which are the 2 main things you need to think about when you're picking players, he doesn't get any. And his points are reflective of that. So you think about, 200 points being an absolutely amazing score and sort of around 140, 150 being good. Kante will get way under 100 points throughout a season. So just because a player is really good for their team doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be the best fantasy options. You really need to be targeting players who are either assisting or scoring goals. Now, I think why a lot of people give up with FPL is often because they miss deadlines. And maybe they haven't used any transfers, or they've kept their player on an injured player, or there's lots of things that can happen. And obviously life is busy and hectic, but if you're going to play FPL properly, you need to make sure that you're at least getting a decent team and making your moves before the deadline. Now, the best strategy I can advise with this is, as soon as you can in the week, set your team up, at least with your bench order and your captain and your vice captain. Transfers are best left until later in the week, because obviously you have more information. Maybe there's Champions League games, cup games, players can get injured in training and all of this. But definitely set your team up at least within your own squad, so that if the worst comes to worst and you miss the deadline, at least you've got a squad with the right captain and the right bench and that kind of thing. Try and make your transfers when you can on Friday night or Saturday morning before the deadline. But if you really do think you're going to miss them, then just make sure your squad is set up. There are advantages and disadvantages of making transfers early, which we'll talk about in another video, I think. And finally, chasing last week's points. So I think when the season starts, you often see lots of people moving to players who have had a good first week. The best example I can give for this is, I remember in game week 1 a few years ago, Lee Cattermole scored for Sunderland. And he showed up really high on the list because it's ranked by points. And his ownership went up to like 30-40% of the game. And that's because people have been like, oh, Lee Cattermole scored, he's really cheap, I'm going to get him in. But just because a player's done well one week doesn't mean they're going to continue on. Lee Cattermole probably got about 3 goals in his life for Sunderland. And, it was just a complete sort of rarity that he did that. So this is where a site like Fantasy Football Scout really comes into its own, because you can look at the statistics of players and you can see whether they're likely to carry on scoring points. So, for example, you could look at Lee Cattermole and see, okay, he had 1 shot in the whole game. He's probably not going to carry that on. Whereas if you had someone like Salah and he was taking 6 or 7 shots a game, all on target, all in the penalty area, creating chances, you'd think, okay, this is a player who I want to get into my side. So keeping sort of up to date with the underlying stats can be really important. It's not always as easy as that. It's not always that someone with good stats will always do well, and equally someone with poor stats might do well. But it's just a good way of trying to kind of predict when players are going to do well, rather than just going by what they've done sort of in the past. So when your team's locked in and you're happy, you're going to be at a screen like this. And obviously here's where you can adjust your bench order and move these around. You can select different captains and vice captains and all of this kind of stuff. So have a play around with this. You can do things like change your kit. You can look at all your leagues, all this kind of stuff. Just one thing I hadn't mentioned was about player prices. So player prices aren't locked in place. So a player can go up and down in price based on how many people are bringing that player in. So you might find quite early in the season, when there's lots of people playing and making moves, that player prices can react quite a lot. So for example, Salah starts the game at 12.5, He might find that if he scores a hat-trick in the first game, by the time game week 2 rolls around, he's gone up to 12.6, 12.7, something like that. And then it just means that player is harder for you to get. So I mentioned about the early transfers. That's where you might have to make early transfers to make sure that you're still able to get those players before they go up too much in price. Equally, player prices can go down. And if Salah doesn't do very well in the first game and everyone decides to sell him, his price could be 12.4, 12.3. And then when you come to sell him, you might find it harder to get in players that you want. There's a bit more complexity around that. Again, I'll explain that more in different video, but that's the kind of basics of how prices work. So I hope this video has been helpful. If you've watched this far, I'd be great to get your comments and feedback in the comments section. If you've got any other videos you'd like me to do, or you'd like me to explain anything in more detail, you can ask me on there, or you can reach out to me on Twitter, ffscout_as. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about anything really. Or if you just want to chat football or FPL, then my DMs, as they say, are always open. So for now, thanks for watching. I would strongly suggest you check out Fantasy Football Scout if you haven't already. We've got a 20% off offer at the moment on membership. It's £20 for the year. I mean, it's crazy value really. And obviously you get all the tools and articles and videos that you could want over there. So definitely go and do that if you haven't. But otherwise, I wish you all the best this season, and I can't wait for it to get started. And I will see you all soon.